Africa needs to re-evaluate its natural capital. The president of the Africa Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, said this on the sidelines of COP29 that is wrapping up in Azerbaijan. According to Dr. Adesina, in 2018, the gross domestic product of African countries accounted for $2.5 trillion, which is some 2.5 times less than the value of its natural capital, estimated at $6 trillion. In recent years, African countries have called for Africa's green wealth to be equivalent to Africa's cash wealth. Indeed, Africa is considered to have great resources of renewable energy as well as more. According to the International Energy Agency, the continent has the potential to benefit from hydropower, which is 35 gigawatts produced in various African countries, wind power, solar power, and geothermal energy sources. In total, 60% of the world's renewable energy resources are present on the African continent. The situation, he said, makes Africa to be green rich but cash poor. Natural capital is asserted to be the world's natural resources, including geology, soils, oil, or better still air, water, all living organisms, oceans, and biodiversity. Indeed, natural capital is the foundation of human existence, providing the basic conditions for life. It supports the economy and society, as well provides people with essential types or means for life. Ladies and gentlemen, in the course of today's edition of Talking Point, we shall be assessing the statements of recent call by Africa for it to re-evaluate its natural capital. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for stopping by. This is Talking Point. Stay with us. In spite of its mineral-rich resource or mineral-rich continent, Africa is still on the brink of having numerous challenges. Meanwhile, there is this call on the African continent for Africa to re-evaluate its natural capital to meet up with what it is actually supposed to be benefiting. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, we'll say thank you for joining us this day on this program, Talking Point of your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Well, today we focus on the resources of the African continent. Meanwhile, the African continent, though is cash poor, experts say Africa is mineral rich. And of course, the continent of Africa is not just rich in the natural capital, but equally has a very growing human capital, which is why we have many partners coming on the African continent. Also, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss this topic of discussion, we've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, Pan-Africanist, economist, and the CEO of Creston Fintech. Thank you, Nicely, sir, for joining us this day.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank our viewers for tuning in as well.
On numerous occasions, we have highlighted that the African continent is a mineral-rich continent, and I recall in the previous edition where we were discussing the energy crisis on the African continent, there was this call for African nations to collaborately, or better say collectively, work hand in hand for them to be able to address this problem. And today we are discussing the issue of Africa's natural capital, where there is this call for Africa to re-evaluate this issue on the African continent. With this call on deck, how would you rate Africa's natural capital, or better still, the Africa's natural riches?
The reality is that the reason why Africa went through the colonial era was because of how rich she is naturally. The reasons why the rest of the world has always looked at Africa has nothing to do with the fact that they were trying to help the African. It has everything to do with the fact that Africa is rich in its diversity so far as her natural resources are concerned. Unfortunately, the only person who does not understand her wealth is the African. And we have not understood on the continent of Africa how we can be able to harness what we have in relationship to our natural resources and then leverage that, so that we can be able to get the capital and the funding that we need to be able to enhance development on the continent. Unfortunately, we have not fully understood that, and that has been, some of the issues I have raised in the past on how we can be able to harness our our full potential, our natural resources, not necessarily mining them, but just leveraging them as a financial instrument so that we can be able to wage that against any loan we are trying to be able to get, and also wage that, towards any transactions that we are trying to have with any other country. I think that countries like Canada are doing that. We should be able, to do that as well. If you show up in some parts of Canada, you will realize that there are folks over there who would use financial instruments, wage that against gold. They go to a mining site, they evaluate what is the cluster abundance of gold in the soil in that particular area, and then they will use that as a financial instrument to wage that against whatever stuff they're trying to do. We need to be able to do that on the continent of Africa. It achieves two things. Number one, it helps us keep the gold where the gold is supposed to be, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is supposed to be in the ground. And it also allows us to be able to use that, wage that against whatever money we are trying to be able to borrow, so that we can be able to get into the developments that we need. I think that is environmentally friendly, is responsible. In that way, we know fully well that we are getting our money's worth so far as whatever investments we are trying to make, is concerned.
Now, I remember some of the leaders that were speaking at the level of COP29. They state that Africa cannot have so much resources, which is what you have stated in your response, but yet, in terms of finances, the country or the continent of Africa seems to still be behind as far as that is concerned, because we have numerous countries on the African continent that up to date are still grappling with issues of debt. They are still grappling with issues of security and others on the African continent, yet we still have this call for Africa to have fair treatment at the level of the global stage. But then we said in our preamble that Africa is not just rich in natural capital, the continent of Africa is equally rich in human capital. You notice that Africa is always supplying, or better still, always having great minds that are on the African continent but are doing great things out of Africa. Now, I would like to go down the line. How can Africa leverage its human capital for its own development?
Well, before we start even talking about leveraging our own human capital, the reality is we need to first of all try to absolutely understand what we have. If you look across the continent of Africa, we basically hold close to about 30% of all the world natural minerals that the world absolutely needs now, about 30%. So the reality is, without Africa, the rest of the world will basically suffer. I'm talking about in terms of technology, in terms of IT, most of our microchips and almost every single thing else in terms of our batteries, 30% of all of that capacity is basically mined from one country, that would be the DRC. It has 30% of the world cluster abundance. And so we have to be able to find ways in which we understand this. Unfortunately, on the continent of Africa, before we start talking about the mass migration of young minds that are leaving the continent for greener pastures outside of the continent of Africa, we need to first of all talk about this. The reason why they're doing so is because the few elites that fully understand the capacity and the wealth that the continent has shielded the rest of the continent from that particular idea. And so if I was going to ask somebody from Nigeria, how many metric tons of gold does Nigeria export every year? No one knows. If I was going to ask somebody in Cameroon the same question, nobody knows. If I was going to ask another person in Ghana that question, nobody would give me an answer. The average guy on the street will not even give me an answer. And even when you have the government giving you an answer, you have to take that by a grain of salt. The reason is because they are murking, these countries, murking the continent dry, and a selected few are absolutely enjoying the benefits thereof. We have to be able to have our mining sector has to be so open. We must demand. Look, I'd rather be interested. I don't care who runs the country. I just want to know what does the country has, because the reality is we are so much focused about talking about democracy and democracy and democracy. And then we jostle this water around like it means nothing, but at the expense of what? That the entire nation is being looted yearly, all right, of the continent, the amount of gold, the amount of diamond, the amount of cobalt, just the sheer volume, of these minerals that is leaving the continent of Africa per annum is crazy. We have to be able to make sure we fully understand what is going on. Unfortunately, that's something that we do not know. And so because we do not know, the notion of us trying to be able to make sure that we can be able to leverage that, understand exactly what the cluster abundance of all of these minerals are in the soil, and then leverage that and pick that also and bring that in. Look, why should we be trying to talk about boring? Have you noticed that anybody who comes onto the continent of Africa that is trying to be able to bring any kind of financing, they're bringing us machines, they'll talk about we're going to do this, they always peg that against our natural resources. And then the issue is, they just basically says, we are bringing you, this is worth maybe 50 million. Nobody ever gets to sit over there and evaluate that, okay, how much of these natural resources are they actually taking out? And because somebody is trying to mine gold, they might also come in contact with diamond. Somebody's trying to mine diamond, they might come in contact with iron. Somebody's trying to do iron, they might come in contact with something else. And unfortunately, we just sit as, just well-educated idiots, and then, the continent is being looted. As long as somebody's giving us pennies to $1, we think we're all right. Meanwhile, the masses are suffering. This is a conversation we need to have, at just an incredibly deeper level than, being just having these superficial conversations. This is something that we need to look deeply into.
Exactly, and that would be at the level of this that are called leaders on the African continent, and that is why there is this call for Africa to have a unified voice, a unique voice as far as voicing some of these concerns within the continent of Africa is concerned. Now, we're moving forward. Now, African leaders have on numerous occasions called for this need for Africa to have a unique voice, which is in line with what I was just saying. But then, when you mentioned that Africa has a lot of what? Africa has resources from gold to diamond, from uranium and others. But then, do you believe that the African continent does know its what? Because every day we're talking about Africa has resources. Africa has done this. Africa does, or say emits less gas emissions to the world. Yes, they are paying more. We have numerous problems that are allocated to the African continent. But do you believe that Africa knows its what when it's actually asking for justice at a global level?
Value is always at the level of the appraiser.
Exactly.
He who appraises value is the only one who fully understands exactly how valuable whatever he's appraising is. Unfortunately, the African has not understood how to appraise her value. If you walked over into any child in Nigeria, Cameroon, Uganda, and ask them about copper, they have no freaking idea what you're talking about. If you ask them about something like uranium, they just, they're what they think is a metal, something we study in school. If you ask them about some things like lithium, they just like, well, what is that? And the problem is we have also educated, or we have a young generation of people who have been educated out of the consciousness of how brilliant and how beautiful the continent is. And unfortunately for that, this is playing in real time. Now, why is the African so demented when it comes to how gifted she is in terms of her natural resources? Is because they have no understanding of value. If you do not understand just how valuable what you have is, then you're going to trash it no matter what. A story is told about some Caucasian guy who showed up in some village many years ago and came into that village and met these young kids, and they were playing with these rocks. They were using the rocks just to play around with it. And then he gave them something like a biscuit or whatever stuff it was, and collected the rock, brought it back and to the Western world, and it turned out to be some of the largest piece of diamond that anyone has ever seen. Now, but that to them was the rock that they could just be playing around with it. That is exactly what is happening to the African. We are sitting on something the world is looking for. Cell phone technology will not be possible without places like the DRC. And unfortunately, if you're going to ask anybody on the continent of Africa, who is holding a Samsung cell phone or an iPhone, or what they thought about places like the DRC, they are totally demented, to that notion that the reason why there's conflict, the reason why their brothers are dying, in places like Goma is because of the same technology that they're holding on their hands. And because we are so ignorant of these things, unfortunately, we do not even understand about the broader perspective on how we can be able to harness that and fully develop the continent the way the continent needs to be developed. I predict that a time is coming when the African will become super conscious when it comes to these issues, but as of now, I think that we are far more interested in becoming westernized, becoming colonized in our mindsets so far as the Western imperialistic structures are concerned, that we have lost sight of what is important so far as the African is concerned. We are empowering Western technology, we are empowering Western civilization at the demise of the African. I think that things really needs to change. We need to have young people on the continent of Africa super conscious, absolutely desiring to see a continent where their grandchildren will be able to convert it into places that looks like Dubai, and bring to the African not just who we can be, but who we have always been. And who we have always been will be in the lights of men like Mansa Musa, in the likes of kingdoms like those of the Benin Empire, those of the Kemetic civilization, those of the Zimbabwe's. We need to do whatever it takes to bring us back at least to that level of greatness where the world actually respects the continent again. Unfortunately, right now, you know, we are beggars. And well, if you want to ask anybody, if you show any image of Africa or ask anyone in the Western world, show up in a place like New York and ask anybody about Africa, the first thing will come out of their mouth is poor, full of war and disease and, you know, malnourished children, because what they see on Western television is nothing else but a dismal, absolute shameful image of the continent of Africa that will make any Africa cringe. Unfortunately, that's our reality. And who do you have to blame? Those dinosaurs we have called leaders.
And that is why we have programs like this to change the narrative on the African continent, portraying the actual image of what Africa is. And of course, the natural asset of the African continent is what trillions of dollars as part of, as far as its gross domestic product is concerned. And there was this call, I'd like to mention that there was this call by numerous leaders to be able to juxtapose the net worth of each country in terms of its natural resources to the gross domestic product of that country. Do you see that feasible, in line with the statement made by Dr. Adesina that Africa stands to be green rich yet cash poor? Now, with that said, do you believe that African countries' gross domestic product could be justified by the natural resources in which these different respective countries do possess?
Absolutely, and I think that this is, integrating our natural capital into such a way that it basically factors into our GDP, so that we can be able to use that for whatever policy planning that we are trying to do. I think it's good. I have two issues with that, by the way. The first is that we on the African continent use our GDP as part of our borrowing mechanism so far as the World Bank is concerned. Whenever we are trying to borrow money, they basically looks at the GDP, which is basically part of our balance sheet. It looks at how healthy the economy is, and then they basically decide, whatever they're going to give us. Since we are gifted in stealing, since we are gifted in always embezzling every single thing that comes into the country, I'm afraid that if you show these idiots how gifted, and how much they can be able to basically, I don't want to use the word inflate, but how they can increase their GDP by basically factoring in, this natural capital, they might be able to now use that and get a whole lot more money, free money, according to them, at the expense of the taxpayer and at the expense of young Africans. I think that, but in the overall perspective, hoping that every single thing was good and that we have the kind of leadership that we need, we should be able to do that. That will be something that is absolutely, because that actually talks about, our true value. Gold in the ground is gold. All right, it's gold. Diamond in the ground is diamond. and it's I think gold and diamond, those are two of those natural resources, and petrol that does not undergo any kind of oxidation, or any other minerals for that matter will not undergo any kind of oxidation while they're still in the ground. So if you want to preserve anything in its true natural form, it's not to mine it, get it out of the ground and then keep it. No, it's to keep it where it is in its natural state, in the ground, because we know that in the ground we have its true value. All right, number one, you can say the same thing for gold. Even though gold outside of the ground will not undergo any kind of oxidation, that's the only mineral in the world that will not undergo any kind of oxidation, but at least if it's still in the ground, we know that the environment is protected until we find better ways of mining it out of the ground to protect the environment. If that was going to be the case, just that document alone that basically talks about how much we have so far as our natural resources is concerned, and then factor that in with our GDP will be, GDP calculations will be absolutely brilliant. I think those are, just brilliant ideas, so that we can absolutely look good on paper and then be able to attract the kind of funding that we're looking for, be able to attract the kind of investments that we're looking for people to come into the continent of Africa and actually, develop some of the sectors that we need help in. Apart from that, I'm only concerned, my only concern is that we have these seasoned thieves, who are running most of our countries, that will carry all of this money when they do come in for their own personal gain. But I'm quite optimistic that maybe a young generation of Africans will rise with an idea that collectively we are better together than being isolated, by the kind of car we ride, or the house we live in, or, or how we travel.
Wow. Hopefully we're going to dive quickly into that. But then on numerous occasions, there has been this call for African solidarity to be at its peak on the African continent amidst the numerous challenges which is facing Africa. But then we've seen the COP29 summit that was talking about climate change, and we have about 54, 55 countries on the African continent. How important would it be for Africans to have a united voice while voicing issues? Because there has been this issue for Africa to have, reforms at the level of the United Nations. Africa has called on numerous changes at a global level, be it at the level of the United Nations, be it at the level of the financial system or an architecture. They have equally called for justice at the level of climate change and others within the African continent. Now, how important would it be if Africa had a united voice while voicing some of these concerns? And of course, leveraging the fact that as one people, in as much as there are different countries within the continent of Africa, it's imperative for them to see one another like a brother's keeper for the betterment of the continent.
Whenever I hear about climate change, the only thing that comes to mind is scamming. When anybody talks about climate change to me, especially when you're referring to us as Africans, you're a scammer. That simply means when Joe Biden sits in the White House and opens his mouth and talk about the fact that he's trying to sign the Green New Deal, well, the world basically goes green, and then they have to bring all these investments into green energy. I'm looking at this man, I'm like, you know what, you're demented. As a matter of fact, you're crazy. The world has gone mad, they've gone insane. We're talking about going green. Let me tell you exactly what that means. That means EVs, electric vehicles. That means solar energy panels. That means battery technology to be able to trap the energy that is being harnessed from the sun and then before transmitting into whatever instruments or equipments that we're using. So those battery pack systems with lithium, they have to use lithium, they have to use some kind of cobalt within those systems so that, they can hold those charges. Now, here we are talking about basically, making sure that the Western world goes green, but we have forgotten that whatever the Western world needs to go green is being mined in third world countries. This is from places like Brazil. This is from places like the DRC. This is from places like Nigeria. We're looking at areas, like in the Sahel. And these are very aggressive form of mining that leaves vast lands completely inhabitable, all right, destroy a whole entire ecosystem so that a bunch of white rich guys in Hollywood and in the United States of America and in Europe, can have their fantasy of going green at the expense of developing nations. That is the hypocrisy. That is what is absolutely unacceptable to any African and to anyone, you know, who absolutely has any moral fortitude. If there's any kind of moral clarity in anyone's mind, you will basically say this is insane. So when somebody wants to talk about, you know, going green and looking at Africa and thumping their nose with your righteous indignation, I hope that somehow we literally think a little bit longer as to what is the cost to the African. What is the cost to places like the DRC? What is the cost to places like Brazil? What is the cost to those in places like Nigeria? What is the cost to those in the mining fields in Ghana, where rivers are literally disappearing? You have rivers in the eastern part of Cameroon disappearing because of our aggressive mining practices. This in itself is laughable. So forgive me if I'm not a fan of this whole entire Go Green movement, because the whole green movement basically does not account to its massive disastrous effect on the ecosystem of the African and of the African continent and also in other developing nations. We have to be a little bit more humane when we start talking about going green. The overall outlook about going green makes sense, but at what cost and to whom? And who is going to pay the highest price? Please, let's be a little bit more humane. I'm talking about those who basically are trying to be able to push us into this whole entire thing. Let us think deeply before just trying to carry out whatever Washington is spewing and, you know, say, oh, let's go green because it's good for the environment. We can't be talking about going green and yet we are the one importing all of the trees and all of the timbers coming out of Cameroon. We have cut almost everything. The whole entire green forest now looks like savanna, because we have chopped everything down and we are talking about going green, and yet we're exporting the wood to countries that are receiving the wood, and yet they're lecturing us on going green, and nobody's talking about reforestation. In the United States of America, if you cut a tree, you plant a tree. In Africa, if you cut a tree, we celebrate you and we hope you cut more. That's how sick and demented we are. Sorry. So
now, given that you mentioned the issue of getting green on the African continent, like Dr. Adesina was saying, Africa is green, yet it's cash poor. Now, you said Africa needs to look for a way or alternative ways through which they can be able to curb this issue of Africa exporting or cutting down the trees, the issue of deforestation. Now, what laws, no, let's not get to laws, what imperative measures could be put on the table as far as resolving this issue is concerned? Because at the end of the day, you will notice that most of the natural wealth on the African continent is being taken out of Africa and is used elsewhere. How can Africa address this particular problem?
It's, well, look, someone is buying. Whenever there is a demand for something, someone will supply.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, the world is talking about going green, and yet they are demanding us to destroy our forests so that they can live comfortably and build whatever structures that they're trying to be outside of the continent of Africa. The world is talking about, you know, the world going green, and yet without technology, and going green without technology, we have forgotten that those living in places like Goma are paying the price for us to go green. And so the idea is, what should Africa do? No, I'm thinking about what should the rest of the world do. If we were really serious and committed on the issues of going green, we will stop buying every single timber that is coming out of the continent of Africa. If we were serious about going green, we will make sure that we absolutely cease and desist from buying any timber that is coming out of Africa. And I will see what those boys in Cameroon will do. Whether they will cut it and sleep on it or whatever stuff that they will do, I will see exactly what they will do. If we were serious about going green, then we will stop. I'm talking about the Western world. We will stop purchasing lithium, stop purchasing cobalt, everything that is coming out of the DRC. We will stop that. Unfortunately, you know, that machine is too capitalistic in nature. Not that I have any issues with capitalism, but it's too capitalistic in nature in such a way that they will absolutely not stop. And here we are. So why don't we propose a tax? Why don't we propose a tax that states that if you're going to cut a tree from the African continent, if you're going to buy a tree from the African continent, you must make sure that that tree is being replaced, number one. Number two, and you must be, and then there's a certain levy you have to pay, and that is what we're going to use to be able to make sure that we bring about some kind of reforestation, right? So why not put up that tax structure so that it can actually help curb and then bring some kind of restoration in terms of our waterways on the continent of Africa that's been destroyed because of aggressive mining, and then bring some kind of reforestation, make sure that we enhance our biodiversity, which is what has made us as a continent and has brought us this very luscious green environment we have so far as the continent is concerned, and then also make sure that our wetlands are basically restored. Unfortunately, the Western world, I wonder if they're going to have that in mind, but that should be where the United Nations basically come in, if they are not more busy, trying to steal from the African like they do in places like Congo.
Well, away from that, there's been this issue of accountability within the African continent. Like you were stating, Africans would have to take some of the tough decisions for the betterment of the African continent. Now, I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago, or about last week, where the Rwandan government, through its Ministry of Agriculture and Resources, is trying as much as possible to preserve some of its forests that it had linked to the history of the country, forests that it tied with some cultural significance to the Rwandan people. I believe that if some of these measures, for instance, are being taken into consideration by numerous governments across the African continent, it's going to go a long way in curbing this issue, which we are seeing of the issue of deforestation and others. But then there's equally this call of accountability. If we have more trees or more resources leaving the African continent, it's because somewhere and at a particular point in time we still have some stakeholders that are validating the exports of these natural resources. So in line with what President Paul Kagame had stated at the level of COP29, how can Africa create some sort of platform that would create or create some sort of space for accountability and fair compensation for the African continent, so we don't have to be coming back to these issues over and over again?
For thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, the Baka people in places like Cameroon has been the forest people. It's been the home for them. It has been a place of their spirituality, a place of their consciousness. They are the forest people. They have roamed the forest for food. They have roamed the forest for their livelihood. And it is from the forest that they have had their medicines, and they have done everything that they could, and they have survived living in the forest for hundreds of thousands of years. And that is their heritage. Recently, we have entered into those forests, and systematically we have been cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, pushing the people further and further away, getting into what is their homeland and destroying everything in our path. That is unacceptable. And so if Rwanda, I think Uganda, if they have decided to be able to bring to basically say that they're going to preserve that heritage. Right. If they say that they're going to preserve that heritage and then make sure that the forest up there is totally, not being touched, that's a good thing. I think that in some parts of Ghana, we absolutely do have that happening in parts of Ghana. Right in Accra, you can show there's a whole entire forest reserve in Accra. I saw that. I was like, man, this is absolutely beautiful. We need to be able to make sure that we push for this. The idea is, look, this is the truth. If a tree is as old as 1,000 years, and you have an idiot who basically picks up a chainsaw and goes into the forest to cut that tree that is, a couple of hundreds of years old, then, so far as I'm concerned, your life too is worthless. Your life is worthless. I mean, there has to be a very deep, aggressive policy when it comes to those who participate in deforestation. The whole entire globe, the whole entire world ecosystem relies on those trees in the Africa rainforest, equatorial rainforest, and also those in the Amazon. That is the recycling system of the world. And so if you keep cutting, you're putting everybody else at risk. What I'm saying is this: you cannot allow these neocons, you can't allow these imperialistic structures out there in the West who are looking for themselves talk about protecting their environments, because you can't cut any tree in the West. You can't just show up with a chainsaw and start cutting out trees in the West. You need permission. And you have to talk about what you're doing, and it has to be approved before you start doing that. But not so on the continent of Africa. Every Jack and Jerry can just show up in a place and then they start cutting, you know, because some guy who is a Caucasian is on the other side of the Atlantic waiting to collect. What I'm saying is we have to be able to put laws. As Africans, we don't need to rely on the West, you know. No, we have to put laws as Africans, which basically instead have this Afrocentric mindset that states that if you are going to cut a tree, we need to know why you're cutting that tree. And if someone was going to catch you cutting a tree, your prison sentence will be as long as that of Nelson Mandela.
But the issue is, if we're putting in place such policies, who are those that will be doing the follow-up to ensure that whatever laws or whatever protocols have been put in place are being respected by the population? Because even at the level of the government, probably at some point, we might have this policies not being respected. So how can we ensure that there is some sort of follow-up at the respective countries, so this gets to benefit in the long run the country in question, or better still, to some extent, the African continent?
Timber will not leave the, whenever you see a private jet landing in the forest in Africa, it's not coming there to carry timber. They're not carrying wood, they're carrying diamonds and gold. We understand that. For something as timber, it has to go via the seaport, all right? Exactly. A vessel will have to carry this goods. So which means that if we are serious and committed about this, we will have to put an end to every a vessel that is transporting wood outside of the continent of Africa. It will not happen. And if we just basically adjust that situation, we kill the market is officially dead, and then those guys can go and do something else. But if we will allow folks, in the name of we do not know how to be able to manage this, to keep on cutting our trees, I think that will be in deep trouble. The bottom line is we have to cut the snake right at the head, and the head will be folks who are shipping this thing out of the continent. Once we have told them that you can no longer ship these goods out of the continent of Africa, then there's no need for them buying from those who are cutting in the forest and bringing it out, you know, to the seashores, to the seaports.
Okay, thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley Fongo. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just are joining us, this is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel, where we're discussing today a statement made by Dr. Akunwamia, the senior of the Africa Development Bank, in line with Africa's natural capital, where there is this call for Africa to re-evaluate its natural capital, be it at the level of sea, air, mineral resources, and all that. So basically, we're discussing this with our guest, Dr. Stanley Fongo. And of course, several pertinent points have been brought on the table. If you're just joining us, meanwhile, you should be watching us on 4U television, and of course, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3, and we're streaming live on our numerous social media platforms. Now, to proceed with you, Dr. Fongo, our topic of discussion this day, it re-echoes this call by Africa to re-evaluate its natural resources. In line with that statement made by the president of the Africa Development Bank, if Africa indeed re-evaluates its natural resources, do you believe that some of these is actually going to get to a point where Africa can get the justice which it deserves?
Well, I'm not sure if Africa will get the justice she deserves if we still have this draconian mindset. Well, we keep electing people to power because they have money and they gave us money during the elections, and who have absolutely no capacity to lead. We need to be able, the only way I think Africa actually gets, any kind of justice will be for Africans to begin to put into power Pan-Africans, begins to put into power people who think more about the continent of Africa, who think more about their people than they're interested in pleasing Washington. I'm talking about people who rather have pictures with other African leaders than always rushing to Russia or running to places like China or the United States or France, to have pictures with the likes of Macron. I'm talking about individuals who will love themselves as being black, who will enjoy the fact that they are Afrocentric in nature, in their consciousness, in their outlook, that they believe so much in what Africa can be, and that will do whatever it takes to bring us out of the stalemate in which we're in. If we have those leaders, then I think that justice will prevail so far as the African is concerned. But as long as you have these neocons, you have all these, folks who are basically up to pleasing Washington, D.C., we will always have issues. And I think that that is the problem that the African has now.
Exactly, and of course countering that problem, you said earlier on, and I mentioned you're an economist, as who were citing that Africa has a lot of wealth on the African continent. When you look at the natural assets of the African continent, it's estimated to be evaluated at some $6.2 trillion. From an economist point of view, what does that mean, or how could that be dissected for the development of the African continent, especially at a time where the continent is reeling from numerous challenges? Could these go a long way in benefiting the continent in terms of its gross domestic product?
That basically means there's no investor that will not want to be in the market, in the market called Africa. There's no investor who is not willing to come. There might be mitigating factors like instability in certain areas and all the wars and all the fighting, because anyone who brings money into the marketplace, who is trying to invest, wants to make sure that they can get their money out. But apart from that, the truth of the matter is that, everybody wants to put their money in this market. So even the venture capitalists will be showing up, banks that are involved in funding infrastructures, they will be showing up. So the question becomes, why is it that it's not happening on the continent of Africa? It's because we have not structured ourselves, to be able to put up a very good package like those of the African Development Bank, those guys in the African Development Bank are pushing, so that we can be able to attract the kind of funding that we need on the continent of Africa. Secondly, I also do believe that there has to be some kind of a public-private partnership on the continent, because all of this government stuff is a scam. It hasn't worked. If you look in most countries on the African continent, whatever the government touches fails. Is it the dams that they try to build that goes nowhere? If you look at the private sector, the folks in the private sector, these are individuals who are interested in actually building something. Look in the West, folks who are creating things are always in the private sector, the Elon Musk of the world, all right, the Dangotes of the world. These are folks who are in the private sector. They are not in the public sector. So, but we have to get some kind of a private-public sector partnership in such a way that we get the authority and the power and the borrowing power of the government, all right, when it comes to attracting foreign investors, and also have the skill sets that comes with the private sector, so that both can be able to now work seamlessly and bring about the structural development that we need so far as the continent is concerned. We need to be able to have trade, open trade on the continent of Africa, and one way for us to do that is to have a cross-continental railway system that will link one part of the continent to another, either from north to south, east to west, and everywhere in between. If we are able to do that, we will now be able to distribute goods that we produce across the continent of Africa to those who live on the continent, and then increase and develop the continent from that perspective, so that somebody who owns a company somewhere in Ghana or somewhere in the DRC DRC, somewhere in South Africa, can be able to sell their goods wherever they want to sell their goods on the continent of Africa without, exorbitant and more expensive shipping cost. We can do that on the continent of Africa. What that means is if we just allow ourselves and give ourselves the opportunity to have folks who can structure these deals, and we can, when we do understand that we are working for the betterment of the continent, not just our own individual selves, we can achieve these feats.
And of course, that is going to need a lot of collaboration from the African continent, from all stakeholders to make this a reality. Now, I remember you said it's imperative for Africa to have some sort of a cross-continental railway framework that is going to link numerous countries. Away from that, do you believe that, I remember in our previous edition you cited that the renewable energy sector would have to be boosted on the African continent. Like you mentioned in one of your previous responses, Africa, or better still, 60% of the world's renewable energy resources are present on the African continent. We were discussing in our previous edition that there are numerous crises, especially the energy crisis on the African continent, and it was imperative for Africa to utilize various or alternative sources of energy for the benefit of the African continent. This might not be directly linked with today's topic of discussion, but I'd like to find out, in that sector of renewable energy, given Africa has so much in terms of its natural assets, in terms of its natural riches on the African continent, do you believe Africa can actually leverage the 60%, which happens to be like of the world's renewable energy resources, to grow and develop the African continent? And how can we shy away from, how can the African continent shy away from this external pressure that is coming very hard on the continent of Africa?
Well, we need to be able to do more. I think, by the way, the 60%, 60 to 60% arable land was actually in terms of agriculture. That means that if you can look at all the farmlands, spaces around the world where we have the capacity to farm, Africa has 60% of that. So, but for renewable energy, I think that we actually have what it takes. And unfortunately enough for the African, our landscapes and our topography, because we rise very rapidly by the time you leave the shores and you're getting inland from the ocean, we rise rapidly. And that's one of the reasons why it is virtually difficult to have any kind of waterway navigation within the continent of Africa. If you look at areas like Asia, if you look at Europe, if you look at the United States, we have the Mississippi, we have the Rhine, and and all kinds of waterways, especially in places like Asia. And if you look at wherever there is inland routes where waterway is navigable by bigger vessels, those areas develop because they bring goods inland. Just look at the continent of Africa. All our major developed cities are along the coast. There's a reason for that, because of our seaports. Exactly. When you go inland, not so much. And those are some of the issues that we are facing. For the continent of Africa, there's no way we're going to have those in routes so far as our boatways are concerned. If we don't just have the topography, does not help us. But we can have railway tracks, and that's the reason why I've pushed that we need to be able to have railway tracks that will be able to take goods from inland out into the shores, and also take goods from the shores inland. We need to be able to do that. I think if we are able to achieve that, that would absolutely help us. Secondly, coming to your question, when it comes to renewable energy, based on the fact that our waterways, rise rapidly, that also means that most waterways, rivers, are a series of waterfalls. Okay, they are a series of waterfalls at every single interval, which is very good for hydroelectricity dams construction. So if you're going to do that, that will be great. But I also suggest that we have a little bit more study in trying to be able to understand the environmental impacts, not to do what was done with the Nile, because now a lot of the Nubian civilization and culture that was along the Nile got lost as a result, of the water dams that were constructed around that area. I think that one of the things we have as Africans that we must be able to preserve is our environment, our cultural heritage. They are of immense value to the Africans and to the future generations. We have to be able to make sure that we preserve that. If we look at places like the Sahel, we can have, you know, a lot of solar energy farms. The sunlight penetration in that particular area is very good, and I think that we can have just a sea of those solar energy plates and then use that to be able to empower about 3 or 4 different countries. Windmill technology is something that we can employ, even though I'm not a big fan, because there's a lot of birds and other species of animals that get trapped. I don't know exactly what is this, the sonar system or the sound system that these things actually do produce. I need to basically look at that a little bit deeper, but most birds get trapped within those solar energy, within those wind turbines blades. And I think that when it comes to the wind energy, windmill, we need to be able to find ways in which we place those things in areas that will be outside of the zones of migrations of birds, and so there has to be some kind of studies that is made. So we have, for sure, we have the capacities on the continent of Africa to go green, but I want us to go green in a way that is a little bit more respectful to our environment, in a way that respects our neighbors. And if you think our neighbors, I'm talking about another human being. No, I'm talking about the wildlife, because those are participants in the same ecosystems that we belong to, and they too have to be respected.
Exactly. Every natural, or better still, every creature needs to be respected. Now, Dr. FONGOD, according to you, you said that Africa needs a cross-continental railway framework across the continent of Africa. I would like to capitalize on that. Now, Africa has a natural capital, which is indeed rich. How can Africa capitalize on this, its natural capital, for the development of the African continent in the aspect of intra-African trade? Because there is this need for Africa to be able to work collectively amongst themselves, connect one country with another. You cited in your previous response that some countries are inland while others are at the coast, and these at some point is detrimental for the development of these countries. So how can Africa leverage some of these opportunities that present them to themselves for the benefit of the African continent in fostering this intra-African trade, which Africans have on numerous occasions advocated for?
If you wanted to build a railway system, and let's say they gave you the cost to be probably about 4 billion. So if you're going to, that's just, use that number just for this example. If the cost was $4 billion US, and you were trying to be able to convince them that they need to come into the continent and do that, one of the best ways for you to do that is to be able to go somewhere on the continent of Africa where we have gold.
Absolutely.
Bring an outside company that will come and do studies on a particular area where gold is available, all right? So once the study is done, they'll tell us that the cluster abundance of gold in this particular area is worth maybe 200 billion. Now, we now take that certificate, which is basically now a financial instrument, and then use that as collateral, for the money that we are trying to get so far as the railway system is concerned. It doesn't mean that we're going to basically tell them to come and then start mining. No, it just basically means that what we're saying.
Study.
Right. What that means is that that particular area has gold worth $100 billion US, and you are asking us for $4 billion US. We're going to use that as a financial instrument that becomes some kind of a reserve. That is more like a little bank. So each time we're trying to borrow money, we say, guess what? Bring your $4 billion and invest in this particular project, and then this project is supposed to give you your money back. But just in case you're wondering if something does have failed, we're able to pay you back. We have $100 billion worth of gold sitting down in this particular location and nobody's mining it. This is the certificate for it. That is how we leverage our natural resources to be able to bring about development on the continent of Africa. This is a railway tracks. We can do that on road. We can do that on seaports. We can do that with airports. All we need is to be able to study the cluster abundance of all the natural resources we have on the continent of Africa, use that as a financial instrument to peg that against whoever is coming in to invest into the continent of Africa.
Absolutely. And of course, Africa, it's rich. Africa has a lot of resources, and Africa is ready for investment, and that would need a collaboration from the various stakeholders, African leaders, why not even the youth on the African continent. Now, moving forward, re-evaluation of Africa's natural capital will equal more enhanced cooperation within the continent of Africa. How do you see this enhanced cooperation pushing for sustainable development, pushing for economic growth and prosperity within the continent of Africa?
Once we start understanding how to be able to use our natural resources and then to be able to peg that against whatever kind of loan or investments we're trying to make on the continent of Africa, is going to open up the continent. And I think that one of the beauty that the continent has is the fact that almost every single country on the African continent has some form of one natural mineral resource or the other, either it be lithium, gold, diamonds, cobalt, whatever you name it. Somebody has uranium, somebody has something somewhere. If we are just able to peg what we have, and then so that we can be able to bring in all these other investors, I think that the continent will open up. And number two, I think that whatever we do so far as the continent is concerned is to be able to make sure that we have this interconnectedness among us as a community, because for us to survive and succeed and thrive on the continent of Africa, we must live in a community, we must operate as a community, we must enhance community participation from governments to government, country to country, rather than just basically acting as individual nations. I think that in itself will not serve us well. We must be able to fully understand that Africa's development will have to be enhanced by community participation.
Exactly, and I'm sure you agree with me that pushing for the Ubuntu perspective is equally going to go a long way in fostering this issue of Africa having a single voice at the global level in terms of fostering its own economic or say internal growth and of course development.
Right. Absolutely. I think that you are because I am.
Exactly.
Almost every single culture on the continent in the world has that some form that has been their driving force, and we too on the continent of Africa, we've embraced that from South Africa, and we're using that. I think that is the one thing that basically speaks to the African more than anything else. I am because you are because I am. We have to basically understand that, otherwise then there's nothing left for us. We are Africans. We are not Cameroonians, we are not Nigerians, we are not Ghanaians, we are Africans. When you step outside of the continent of Africa, nobody cares, where you're coming from. Once they see you, they see a black man, they see someone who is African, and somebody, when you speak, nobody has to come be asking where you're coming from. They just know you're African, you're black, and that's what it is. When they see someone from Tanzania, someone from Uganda, somebody coming from Cameroon, they just say, these are Africans. And that's who we are. We are Africans. I'm proud to be an African. And there's nothing wrong in me being an African. As a matter of fact, I think that I'm blessed to have been born African. The notion that somehow you were supposed to be born outside of the continent of Africa is crazy. I was born into Africa. I'm an African. I carry unique sets and skills that permits me to be African. And I will fail at being anything else but African.
Exactly, and of course we are African. Now moving forward with you, Dr. FONGOD, we've touched literally every aspect as far as the natural capital is concerned, given that we've touched the issue of geology with Africa's mineral resources, we've touched air, water, and biodiversity. But away from that, we have this issue of soils on the African continent. And I recall you were mentioning in one of your responses that Africa needs to invest in agriculture. Agriculture is the backbone of every society. Now, given that agriculture is so much important to Africa, and especially as Africa is headed towards prosperity, amidst all the challenges, how can African countries harness some of the potentials which they have to foster or push for, say, implementing more agricultural systems within their respective countries for the growth of the country?
I think that we need to be able to do two things. So far as agriculture is concerned, I'm excited about, the prospect that the continent has. We've all seen a lot of young people who have left the United States of America. They are in Africa, in Ghana, Cameroon, Nigeria. They are out there basically doing a lot so far as the agricultural sector is concerned. And frankly speaking, kudos to them. One of the things I'm far more interested in is how we basically get to the place of conversion and transformation. How do we convert and transform the produce that we produce in our farms? How do we transform that into somewhat, into a state in which it can last for a long time? Maybe tomatoes into tomato paste, maybe finding ways in which we can be able to convert some of our spices, dry them up, and then package them and export them. I'm trying to figure out how we do that. If you look at the country like Nigeria, of all the fruits that she produces per annum, she only consumes about 15% of that, and then the rest of it basically just goes to waste. It gets rotten because there is no system in the country that can be able to transform fruit into fruit juice concentrate, but yet the country is importing close to about $800 million worth of fruit juice concentrate. That's where you make your juice and whatnot. I was visiting Nigeria many years ago, about 2016 or 17, and I remember drinking something called exotic juice. I was in Lagos, and I was like, man, this stuff is kind of nice. And the gentleman, Uche, who was with me, said, oh wow, this is very proud. This is produced in Nigeria. I'm like, wow, really? So I picked up the bottle, just trying to read the ingredients. And I soon realized that the only thing that was actually produced in Nigeria was the water that was used in the whole thing, because everything else was imported, including the fruit juice concentrate itself. And so this is exactly where we are as Africans. We probably learn how to assemble a couple of things on the continent of Africa. It's not that we produce anything. So we have to be able to learn how to get into the transformative stages of things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Of course, at that point, Africa needs to take the bull by the horn and first get involved in some of these transformative measures. Now, like I recall, there's countries like Egypt, like Ethiopia, that in recent years have started exporting some of their agricultural produce to meet up with, say, a demand from foreign markets, and of course, boost their in turn home revenues. Now, we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of the program. Now, could you start ways of parameters to which Africa can harness its potential for the development of the continent, given its rich natural capital and, of course, human capital, which the continent as of now stands to possess?
I think the continent needs to basically do an appraisal of our natural resources. If we do an appraisal of our natural resources, get the right people in the right place to be able to figure out what we have, how much of it we have, we can be able to use that particular documentations to peg against whatever loan we are trying to get, and then to be able to attract investors to show up in the continent of Africa so that we can develop our lands. I want us to also understand that long after the mining ceases, long after the last caterpillar would have gone through a particular area because of this mining expedition, long after a gold washer would have been lifted from a mining field, long after the last piece of diamond would have been examined in a diamond mine, long after the lithium fields would have been abandoned, that land will have to be used for agriculture. Whatever we do on the continent of Africa so far as our mining and our mineral resources are concerned, I want us to have this consciousness in mind. Long after all of this stuff, we have to go back to mining. We have to go back to agriculture, rather, because agriculture is the only thing that will survive and the only thing that will sustain us long after all the mineral resources have been mined. If that was going to be the case, we must make sure that we have a type of mining on the continent of Africa that is respectful, that is meaningful, that respects the environment, not to have the type of mining on the continent of Africa that basically destroys the environment. If we look at a place like the DRC, children have been born with cleft palates because of the hard minerals that are in the water. That means the people who live in the environment, they will soon be suffering from all forms of cancer as a result of the aggressive mining practices that is taking taking place in those areas. This also goes to those folks living in the eastern part of Cameroon. This goes to the guys in Ghana, to the same individuals in Nigeria. The government needs to be a little bit more responsible to their people than to sit in their beautiful palaces and just do nothing. We have to become a little bit more responsible to our people and our environment. This is the way forward, and I think that this is the only way in which we basically make things happen. We don't have to mine. All we need to do is to know what we have an expert tell us exactly what is the cluster abundance of it in this world, use that and develop the nation.
Absolutely, that is the way forward. Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD, for your insight, brilliant insight on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much.